late or not? Okay, we got 2 missing today. We might as well get started. Any other assignments? Assignment 4. So we got a bunch of them collected already. Anybody else? Adding to the collection?
I'll start typing on these because I just read them.
Okay. It just makes, I'm an old man, it makes it easier to read.
Yeah.
No worries, no worries. I didn't make that exactly clear. So if you can type things out.
My only problem is I can't connect my MacBook to the printers here. I don't know why. Like I gotta send it to somebody else for them to print it for me. That's the only issue I have.
Okay. Is that an issue you can work around or no?
I mean, yeah, I can try. Like I got.
Okay.
I can try. Yeah, I can do that.
If you can work together, that it's easier on my eyes. So I'm an old man. Sometimes fighting to read handwriting can be a challenge. So it just helps. I guess there's a hardship there. It's not required. Everybody got the handouts? I think everybody here's got the set I gave you on Tuesday. So I think those that are missing are still missing. So, okay, we got to give that to Janet when she gets here. Okay, lecture 10. What do we got? Maybe something. So review session after lecture today, if you want it. It'd probably be helpful if you don't understand the grading of the questions or confused or you think what answer were you looking for. Those are certainly good questions for the review session. You could also take a look at the questions in advance and say, hey, I don't know how to answer this. Can we go over what might be included? We'll take a break. Everybody's got their assignment 4 in. 5 up on Blackboard. Hard copy. Opens up on Blackboard. Next week. So exam choices. So not next week, but the week after. We can either have the exam on Tuesday and then spend Thursday up to Derry doing hands-on stuff. Or we can flip that around. We go up to the Derry complex on Tuesday, muscles, bones, making sure we learn all those things correctly, and then have the exam on Thursday. This was the preference last time. Is that still the preference? What are your preferences? Exam on Tuesday, and then we go up to the Derry on Wednesday to get ready for the next exam, basically. Okay, so we'll go with that. I'll try to get that posted, although in the next 24 hours is going to be a little bit of a challenge, just because I have additional responsibilities. We got to move snow. Does anybody know if there was a pickup up at the dairy this morning? The dairy complex, did we have milk pickup this morning? Does anybody know? I can't remember which day it is.
There was last night, because I went last night, and there was like 3 pickups there.
No, the milk pickup.
The milk pickup, the big truck coming in the morning.
No, that's tomorrow.
Okay, so that means I need to get up early and help clear out for that. Just, okay, so in my mind, I gotta get up there before the milk truck does, so they have a place to park. So that,
Hang on, question. Are you
Yes.
talking tractor trailer or pickup truck?
the pickup of milk with the big tractor trailer.
Gotcha, okay.
So, I can never remember which day it is, so. We got a big snowstorm coming in tonight. They're here 7 o'clock in the morning. The campus will do the driveway going up, but they won't do that area between the barns. So this is as far as we're going, and we're going no farther, so we're responsible
How many times a week do they go?
every other day.
Every other day?
So you never know which day it is. This week it's Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Next week's Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
So do they only come at 7 o'clock in the morning, like once a day?
Yep.
Gotcha.
So unless they got to split a load, but they don't usually split it with us.
No?
So they usually do other people, but the morning milking has to be done by 7 on pickup days, so that can be a challenge. So grading assignments, reminding how that gets done. If you've got a 3 there, you got more than needed. 2, that would be mostly complete for an exam, not necessarily 100%, but probably 75 to 80% or more for the exam. A 1 is lacking something in my mind. I was looking for something additional, or it's not quite right or something like that. 0 isn't, does not answer the question. What I do with the assignments, if you turn them in, you get full credit. It's meant to be a learning experience. I need to do a better job of getting things back faster to you so you can turn that over, learn things. But if you turn it in, you got full credit for the assignment. So it's a, did you turn it in or not? And remember how we do things here. Lectures determine the assignment, which determine the exam. We take the assignments 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the next exam. And that's what's, we're going to have my choice of questions. So release something close to that. So any questions or concerns? So last time we talked about the axial skeleton, basically skull, vertebrae, the things attached immediately to it, focusing on the ribs, sternum, there. So we're going to move over to the appendicular skeleton, which is basically the legs. So appendicular skeleton, bones that make up the limbs, which allows us, our animal, to move, have posture, all those things, scratch, itch, whatever it needs to do. So if we think about purposes, we'd say supports the animal, allows the animal to move, locomotion, that sort of stuff. So learning your bones, I have a set, I think it was not in the last set I gave you, but the set before, so a week ago I gave you a set that gave you this diagram and then a list of bones that I'm going to ask you to be able to identify or remember. So learning your bones, if we look on this diagram, anywhere you see B, that's an abbreviation for bone. So we've got parietal bone, temporal bone, occipital bone. It's just trying to clean up the diagram, trying to make it a little bit more readable. So these are the bones I'm going to ask you to learn. They are all on that list. We'll go through them one set at a time. But we're going to have a set from the axial skeleton, a set from the front leg, and a set from the back leg. So let's I guess the question is, how do you feel about that? Are you excited at the thrill of doing this? Or is it more like yikes? So this is pretty much straight memorization. I will use the same diagram that you're working with for the exam. So for the axial skeleton, we're going to ask you to aggregate the skull or the cranium. Ask where the frontal bone is. We need that for making sure we get our target right. The mandible, the jaw. We're going to aggregate the ribs. We've got the sternum, the sacrum, and then the 5 different sections of the spinal column. So which ones are which? Looking at those, if you're marking your diagram, we don't have an aggregate for the skull or cranium, so I put that off separate. The frontal bone, that plate we go through if we're using a captive bolt or a gun. We got the mandible here, sternum. We've got the ribs, and then the sacrum back there. Then we've got the 5 sections of the spinal column, which we've discussed already in class. Everybody have those that want those off the diagram. So the next set in the list is the front leg. So scapula, humerus, radius, ulna. Carpals we're going to group together. Metacarpals we're going to group together. And then you have the 5 bones at the bottom of the foot. P1, P2, P3. And the 2 sesamoid bones. So you're going to have those 4 times in the front, 4 times in the back. So if you're looking on your diagram, scapula is up top, the big blade thing here. We have the humerus. That's the first bone going down. Then we have the radius in front, the ulna in the back. In our cows, those are fused. In us, they are not. What is the advantage of them not being fused in us, the radius and the ulna? I can twist my hand. Radius, ulna, they're separate, so I can move the bones back and forth around. So added dexterity that our 4-legged friends do not have. We've got all the carpals in here in the knee. We're going to use them as a group. So you've got a whole lot of different ones there. And then we're going to have the metacarpals in between the foot bones and the knee. So those bones are kind of aggregated together. In us, we have separate fingers. Cows tend to fuse things together. Wrist, not nearly as flexible. So if we think about it, the carpals here are basically your wrist bones. We have much more flexibility and dexterity. Those cows do not have that flexibility and dexterity. The 5 bones at the bottom of the leg are listed on the backbone. They use proximal sesamoid, proximal phalanx, middle phalanx, distal sesamoid, distal phalanx, as opposed to P1, P2, P3. So these here are the same in the front from here down. The back leg, a little bit more abstract. We don't really always think about these. Wing of the ilium, coccygeal tuber, ischium, ischiatic tuber, pubis, femur, patella, tibia, talus, tuber, tarsals, metatarsals will group together, and then the 5 bones at the end. So if we look at our diagram, the back limb, wing of the ilium up top here, coccygeal tuber, that's your hook bone. Tuber in the back, ischiatic, that's your pin. Ischium, body of the ilium, wing of the ilium. You've got your pubis in the back, femur, patella. What's the patella? What's a common name for patella? Kneecap, right? That bone on the top of our knee. Tibia, tuber is in the back, talus is in the front. We group all our tarsals together. We group all our metatarsals together, and then the 5 bones at the end. So those are what I'd like you to be able to identify. I think that's a useful list if we're talking to a vet on the phone. I think she broke her whatever. That'll get the vet in the right location. Anybody still need that? So if we go with something where I'm asking you to fill things in, spelling mostly counts. Get me to think of the right word, and we're doing okay. So you should have that list in last Thursday's handout. Okay. I'll move where you need to. Do you need anything else? Need more time on this? Okay. So there's the full list. If that's of help to you, you got Emily's list, so. Okay, so a lot of memorization, learning things. So how might we learn our bones? I brought I've given you a blank there. So taking your list, trying to find out what's where. We're going to make sure I get that up on Blackboard. So using that diagram, working our way through. Probably for me, thinking about it, trying to memorize it in order, what that list is, working from top to bottom. There are medical students to memorize everything. They'll use the first letter of each thing and make sentences out of them that match so you can remember what order everything is in. Another thing you might be able to do is compare it to yourself. So here's a human skeleton, where everything might be. If we compare that to the cow skeleton, what's where? So skull and skull match up. Got the mandible and the mandible matching up, the jaw. Scapula, humerus. So the humerus is up here on us. Radius and ulna. Parallel to each other. Then we get down to the carpals. The cow's knee equals our wrist. And then we have our cow basically walking on the two middle fingers that are equivalent to our two middle fingers. Work it down so you've got the different bones, P1, P2, P3. Well, no, that's tarsals, P1, P2, P3 at the end of your fingers. So metacarpals, carpals, phalanges are going to be your phalanx in your cow. Femur, patella, tibia, tarsals. Another interesting approach was, at least for me, somebody did this with a horse, figuring out where everything is and sort of drawing things out. So instead of drawing a picture of the bone, drawing a picture of what the name of what the bone is for that particular area. So another approach to helping remember where everything is and what everything is called. Any questions about learning your bones? So we'll have an opportunity to go up to the, might do it in the greenhouse, more likely we'll do it in the other classroom, see all these bones in person. I had the skull. You'll have to see all the other ones, label them, take pictures of them to help you remember what they are and where they are. So that'll be a week, 2 weeks from today. We'll go up to the dairy and do that. The letters. Pull out your letters. Let's see what questions we have today. Which of the following is false? Starch is a polymer of glucose. Protein is a polymer of amino acids. DNA is a polymer of nucleic acids. Lipid is a polymer of fatty acids. So a semi-tricky question. Certainly these things over here are used to make these things, but lipids are not polymers. So all of these are polymers, this is not. It does have a connection, but you've only got 3 fatty acids to a glycerol, and that's it. It's not technically a polymer. So lipids are the main component or building block of what? Plasma membrane, cytosol, cytoplasm, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum. When I started to write this question, certainly is A what I was going for, but I can't mark C or D wrong. They are made up of membranes, just like the plasma membrane. They're continuous. The definite wrong answer is cytosol or cytoplasm. Water is the main component or building block of what? Cytosol is cytoplasm, probably be the most correct answer there. You're not going to have any water really in the plasma membrane. You're going to have water inside the endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi apparatus, but that's not what they're all about. The ribosome is part of the what? D is the answer we're looking for. You have done these already? Okay, so we're building our way up. We've got components, we've got cells. We're moving up to tissues. And the first tissue we're going to talk about is the bone. So bone is the tissue that comprises the skeleton. It's really different than almost any other tissue in that it's got a matrix around the cells that is unique to the body, but it does the purpose it's intended. So we tend to think of bones as kind of inert, dead things, but in the live animal, they're very much living. They're doing a lot of different functions and helping that animal out. So bone has a very complex vascular system. So we need a lot of blood to get done what needs to get done in the bones. We have the blood vessels coming from the outside, working their way in, and then blood and nutrients and oxygen have to flow to all that tissue, and that gets really complicated in bone. It has the ability to store energy in the form of fat, and that's called the yellow bone marrow. When the fat accumulates there, the inside of our long bones takes up or becomes a yellow in color. This is one of the things they'll use to assess the energy status of a deer as it works its way through the winter. Beginning of the November-ish, these should be pretty full of yellow fat. As they work their way through the winter, that yellow fat becomes pretty non-existent. Bones have the ability to manufacture blood cells. So erythrocytes and leukocytes. Does anybody know what the common name for those are? What's an erythrocyte? Red blood cell. Leukocyte is a white blood cell. So formal names for what we're used to dealing with. And it's not unusual for 90% of all calcium in the body to be found in the skeleton. So calcium is used for a number of different things in the body. Having that reserve there, having that opportunity to pull it when you need it, store it for later use, is also one of the functions of the skeleton. When we're thinking about what the bone is composed of, bone tissue, you should have this diagram in your handouts. Very specifically to bone, you're going to have the cells that are there, and then you're going to have a matrix, the material that's going to surround these cells. The matrix is going to have organic components that are based on carbon, that hydrocarbon backbone with functional groups, and the inorganic components. The main inorganic components are calcium and phosphorus. You're going to find magnesium fluoride and a couple other ones in there as well. But the bulk of the bone is made up of, inorganic is made up of calcium and phosphorus. Then we have the organic matrix, which is basically the scaffolding that's created that'll form the shape of the bone. And once that shape is established, you're going to have calcium and phosphorus put in there to make it rigid, to make it less floppy. So collagen, non-collagen proteins, those are all amino acids. Mucopolysaccharides, we're adding carbohydrates into the mix. So especially at the ends of bones where things have to move, making them a little slipperier. Carbohydrates are really good at holding water in those locations and making those joints glide a whole lot better. From a cells, the four we're going to worry about in this class are the osteoprogenitor, the osteocyte, the osteoblast, and the osteoclast. So osteo means bone, so O-S-T-E-O. That prefix, whenever you see that, you're dealing with something that's related to bone. So bones, if we look at the total body, most of the weight of the bones is associated with the mineral content, that calcium phosphate mineral that makes up the bone. So you have a 3-to-2 ratio of calcium to phosphorus, 3 calciums for every 2 phosphates or phosphoruses. Most of when we're feeding our animals for maximum efficiency, we're going to fall in a 1-to-1 calcium to phosphorus or 2-to-1 calcium to phosphorus ratio. So that you can see that brackets that 1.5, 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 1.5 falls right in the middle. So you've got that ratio there. What's going to happen is we've got hydroxyapatite, calcium phosphohydroxide, and we can have fluoride replace that OH group and form bone. Calcium and phosphorus, calcium phosphate is the main ingredient. That hydroxyl on the end there, the OH2, can be replaced by anything that has a 1 negative charge, so fluoride, chloride, or carbonate. Probably bicarbonate for that single charge. But the weight comes from the calcium and phosphorus. The volume of the bones comes from matrix. That protein, that connective tissue that provides the bones their shape. So if you kind of look at where most of what's there, the volume is the protein. And the exact relationship is dependent on age. So when we're young, we have a lot more matrix. Things aren't fully fused, things aren't fully developed. I always say with little kids, they bounce, whereas if I fell over like that, I'd break something because they still have a lot of matrix that isn't been solidified or made rigid by the calcium and phosphorus. Has anybody ever done that experiment where you take a chicken bone and you soak it in vinegar and it makes it bendy? So the idea behind the vinegar is you're going to pull out all the calcium, you're going to make that bone less rigid, and you're going to be left with the volume. It still looks like a bone, but it's supposedly floppy. Every time I've tried to do it, I can only get a little bit of bend in there. I can't seem to get it fully go. So I don't have it for this class. I've tried soaking it in vinegar to pull out the calcium. Doesn't seem to work for me. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. If we're talking about dependent on age, in this diagram, the blue is cartilage. It's that connective tissue. It's that matrix. So in the embryo, we don't have a lot of calcium there. We don't need that rigidity yet. The baby doesn't need to stand up. As we get older, that matrix cartilage is displaced by rigid bone, calcified bone. As we get to an adult, all the growth areas here disappear, and the only place we have cartilage is on the end where one bone is articulating with another bone. So when we're little, we're a little bit more flexible. As we get older, we've calcified everything up. When I was at my last job, one of the cows that was born had 2 heads, or at least 2 noses. So you had 4 eyes, and basically a head came together like that. One of the PhDs there said, I'm going to try to preserve the head, see if we can, use it. But the problem is, taking everything apart, that skull is still cartilage, and it's very floppy and doesn't hold up real well. So as she tried to take the skin and stuff off, everything fell apart, and it was an unsuccessful attempt to preserve that skull. So the proportion of matrix, organic to inorganic, is going to change over time, and what cells we have where is probably going to change over time. Muscle is continually remodeling to become as strong as it can be with the least amount of weight. So we're looking at bone cell types. We're going to focus on four aggregate groups. There's the osteoprogenitor. This is a stem cell for bone cells. So the osteoprogenitor can become any of the other 3. So we have the osteoblast. The osteoblast is responsible for building bone, laying down another layer, creating that matrix, creating that calcium, building more bone tissue. The osteocyte is key in our calcium balance. It's basically the ATM or the teller at the bank trying to maintain our blood calcium. When blood calcium is low, it'll put more calcium, take it out of reserve, put it into the blood. If we've got too much calcium in the blood, it'll take it and store it for later. So making sure that we have the right amount of calcium in the blood is the osteocyte, and I will suggest to you that if we're managing milk fever, we're managing the osteocyte. Making sure that it's doing its job so that animal does not get sick. Osteoclast clears bone. So you've got the osteocyte. It's going to be involved in blood calcium levels. We have the osteoblast, osteoclast, that are going to be working in opposition. One is building bone, one is taking bone away. At least in my mind, it'd be really nice if the blast was the one that got rid of it, but it's not. So if we think about the bones as a whole, looking throughout the body, we're going to have 2 types of bone tissue. We're going to have compact bone, also known as hard, dense, or cortical, usually because it's on the outside of our bones, the cortex. Then we're going to have spongy bone, cancellous or trabecular. And we mean spongy because it's full of holes, not because it's squishy. So the compact is usually on the outside of the bone. Spongy is usually on the inside of the bone. So we think of compact as the main strength of the bone, usually the outside of the cylinder of the long bones. And then we have the spongy bone inside that's helping prop up, make sure that cylinder doesn't collapse in one direction or the other. So we got a diagram there that's going to show those differences. We've got one end of the bone, we've taken out a chunk. We have that compact bone on the outside, more or less solid. And then on the inside, we've got that spongy bone that's not nearly as filled. There's a scaffolding there that's meant to act like trusses and also allow the blood vessels to get in and get out, flowing through, providing nutrients to the interior of the bone for the processes that are there. So the spongy bone is going to have the cell marrow in it where the blood cells are manufactured. We've got that yellow fat in there that's going to allow that energy storage. We got blood vessels working from the outside, going through, providing the interior of the bone with the nutrition it needs. This is a stereograph. If we could get one to each eye, you'd get a feel for the 3D nature of the bone. So that spongy bone in there, you can see here, we're trying to create trusses that provide strength to the bone, but don't require complete filling of the bone. So we're trying to get as much strength as we can with as little material as we can. So, or how is it similar to bone? I've already said it's because it's full of holes, not because it's squishy. It's very rigid. You can't compact it. If you've ever taken a bone apart, it's very resistant to force. So if we're looking at compact bone, now what we've done here is done a transverse plane across the bone, and then we're looking down on it. And what you're going to see are these cylinders here, 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 that are going to form rods that make that compact bone more or less solid. If we're looking at it from a physiological standpoint, you have the blood vessels moving in the center, and then each of these little kind of black oblong areas is a place where a cell sits. Everything else is matrix. So blood vessels in the center, and then you've got these little black areas are where the cells sit. All this purplish area is matrix. So what we're establishing here are these osteons, these cylinders that go down through. We have a central blood vessel in each of them that's going to provide nutrients to those cells, but those cells are surrounded by matrix, so everything's got to leave the blood cell and then work their way into these little canals to get to each of the spidery areas, which is where each bone cell is. So you have the connection there, blood vessel, central canal. You have the little lacunas that are the canals that connect each cell one to the next. And then these little spidery areas are the osteocytes and where they sit. So the nutrients, the oxygen leaving the blood has to find its way into these little canals, the lacuna, and drift to those individual bone cells. So those bone cells are not right next to each other. They're down a little tube. Their neighbor is down a little tube, the distance away. So this is one of the reasons that skin heals much faster than bone, is you have to reestablish all these canals and connections, and the nutrients have to work their way through the system, and that takes more effort, takes longer to get done. So it takes a little while for the nutrients to get from the blood vessels through the system to the individual cells. What you're having there with the osteons is they keep forming new ones. So the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts say, we're going to make a new one right up here as we make that bone bigger or longer. So you're seeing one sort of temporary, newly formed erases some of the older ones. So that's why you got these weird overlaps when you're looking down on that. So this one here is probably the newest one in the area, or this one. This one's been chewed away by this one. This one's been chewed away by that one as they move forward and continue to form. So looking down on that, we've got the little canals that are going to provide nutrient to those osteocytes. The osteon cylinder there, the osteon. We're looking down at that. We got the blood vessel in the center. The Herversian canal in the center. Canalcula. Calculi. The little canals that connect the distant neighbors that are the osteocytes. Another representation of that, got a kind of a slicing a osteon from top to bottom. You can see how that's concentric circles. We've got cells or canals that go out, canals that go around, making sure that every osteocyte can get the nutrients it needs and get rid of the waste products it has. But because it has to travel a little bit farther, a little bit more complicated, things are a little bit slower. So as we put those bones together, we tend to have the osteon or Herversian systems on the outside. Every one of them's got its own blood vessel in it. Making sure those service all of the different osteocytes, and then we get to the spongy bone in the middle. So bone serves a number of diverse purposes, and as I've mentioned before, one of the basic rules in AFP, almost everything in the body has 2 or more functions. So each of our minerals usually does 2 or more things. Certainly calcium does a lot of different things. Sodium does a lot of different things. The more useful it can be in the body, the more likely it is to be around. So bone is going to give us structure, protection, support. As terrestrial animals, we sort of need that. As animals that are moving, we need to be able to push against something with our muscles or pull against something rigid with our muscles to produce movement. We've already said houses the bone marrow that produces blood cells, stores calcium and phosphorus, and energy storage in the form of fat. So why don't you take your break? We'll start again at 5 of. Somewhere in Marshall is all I know, so I would assume 101. Or it might be here, just,
Egg comes here.
okay, so 101 is where I'd guess. I believe he said Marshall Hall when he sent out the announcement. So, so we got a few minutes afterwards to find, so long bones, we've got, we think of traditionally where our long bones will work, but you're going to have marrow in almost every bone you have. There are very few solid bones in the body, except maybe in the ears. So you're going to have that spongy bone in the middle. That spongy bone is going to allow the formation of our blood cellular components, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are formed in that long bone. So when we're talking about long bones, you're going to have 5 different parts in each of your long bones. You're going to have the epiphysis at either end. So the one closest to the body, or the spinal column, would be called the what epiphysis? Anybody want to guess? The one farthest away from the spinal cord or the body would be called the what? Where in our vocabulary we talk about things close to the spinal cord and things farther away. Proximal and distal. So every long bone's got a proximal end and a distal end. So if we look at our bones, you're going to have cap on either end, and you're going to have one that's proximal and one that's distal. So this is highly stylized. This diagram over here shows a ball and socket joint. That whole area up here is called the proximal epiphysis. The area down here, epiphyseal plate, separates those end caps from the rest of the bone. So in the center, the middle section, we have the diaphysis. So di meaning, I guess in this case, not. So this is the cylindrical shaft of the long bone. It's the middle section that we're going to find straight and long, not really varying in diameter. So we look at that in this particular bone, here to here, more or less the same diameter, the entire length is the diaphysis. As we get down to the sections between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, we have the metaphysis. Metaphysis. It's the flared section as we get toward the end, where it flares out, flares out. So 5 sections, and again, we'll have a proximal and a distal section. So proximal meta up here, distal metaphysis down here. So depending on how much flare there is, you're going to have varying lengths of those metaphyses. So knowing these different parts, and it's an opportunity to learn how things grow. So bones tend to lengthen from the epiphyseal plate. So between the metaphysis and the epiphysis, there's the epiphyseal cartilage. You can call it the epiphyseal disc, or when I was dealing with my knee issues, the epiphyseal plate. So it's a layer of cartilage that separates the cap of the bone from the shaft. And this is an area of immature bone. And it's where your bones lengthen from. They'll be remodeling to keep the shape and extending the cylinder and keeping the flares and stuff. But you're going to have kind of building on in both directions from this epiphyseal plate. And it's important that we don't damage that plate as we grow, or we get two different lengths of legs. A friend of mine's father broke his leg and it cracked through the epiphyseal plate. He had a 4-inch difference between his legs because once that heals itself, it stops growing, and we call that closure. So it stops lengthening the bone. So he had a huge difference between the lengths of his legs because that happened. Nowadays, if that happens, there are certain things medical community can do to keep that plate immature, not allowing it to close down. We had a student a couple years ago, electrostimulation allowed her to keep her legs the same length as she broke through that part. So when we're talking about that growth, it's the difference in this area here. This growth plate is going to lengthen the bone. It's going to continue to build things up, lay things down. As we go through puberty, we become an adult. Those growth plates calcify and our long bones stop growing. So once we hit puberty, we're more or less done from a growth perspective. So what if the epiphyseal plate breaks? Bad things happen. I've mentioned that already. So you've got the growth plate. The growth plate down here, you got your epiphysis, your shaft of the bone there. What that plate does is lay down first an organic matrix that moves, keep building that up, and then over time that matrix is calcified. So it's going to make that bone longer. So when we're dealing with bone, we're dealing with growth, we're dealing with a break. A number of things have to happen. So the first part is we have that growth area. We're going to have proliferation. The cells that are there are going to divide, have daughters, create new bone cells. Second thing that's going to happen is those bone cells are going to get bigger. After they get bigger, they're going to start to put matrix around themselves. First, the protein, then the calcium. So if we're talking about a bone, they're laying down those layers, and that calcification is going to work its way up. So the bone gets longer. So zone of proliferation, zone of hypertrophy. We call it ossification. Zone of ossification, where those bone is finally formed and things become rigid. So this is the growth plate up here, having those parent cells that are going to break off as daughter cells or multiply as daughter cells and eventually create that new bone, lengthening the bone in each direction. So the length of a bone is influenced by hormones. Estrogen and testosterone are key. puberty, once we get well established into that, we shut down that growth plate and our long bone lengths are more or less established. So once those plates are closed, the growth of the long bones is complete. So we've got our long bones. We're usually thinking about our legs, the things that we have that are going to give us our stature. If we take our oxen and we castrate them before puberty, those growth plates don't shut down. And we start to get animals that continue to grow, continue to have long bone growth. So those oxes are going to get taller than maybe the intact male would. Because we never go through puberty, or at least in the true sense. So those long bones don't close, they continue to grow. So that's usually why some of these oxes can get very, very tall. So bone is a very active tissue. Bone is constantly being formed and resorbed, constantly reshaping. The osteoblast, the osteocyte, and the osteoclast are putting matrix down, taking calcium in and out, taking matrix up. The idea is that with moderate activity that impact exercise, the bones are going to say, I need a little bit more strength over here, a little less strength over here. Move the structures, move the strength over to this spot, and the individual bone cells will try to make that happen. So that constant turnover is called remodeling, bone remodeling. We alluded to that in our toe bones that are being pulled on. They're trying to hold on to that thing and they sort of grow out. They're remodeled kind of in the wrong direction, and it's going to be hard for them to come back. So with bone tissue, the matrix, we use it or move it. If it's of no use, especially when you're young and growing, we move it to other locations. Not needed here, I can put it somewhere else. We got a micro crack over here. Oh, we got a weak spot, let's build up over here. So the goal with remodeling is maximum strength with minimum weight. And this is one of the challenges for the people that are spending time in space, is you don't have gravity telling the bones what they need to do, where they need to be strong, and the general signal is, well, you're not using your bones, let's get rid of some of this weight so we don't have to carry it around. The longer you stay in space with zero gravity, the longer you run into issues of bone weakness. So the osteoclast and the osteoblast are the ones that are going to get this done. Osteoblast is going to generate new bone. Osteoclast is going to clear that bone. And for those that are really into it, there's a whole lot of different bone factors, growth factors, signals that the osteoclast and the osteoblast respond to. These are all different proteins that are going to tell them to start up or slow down, speed up, die. Those are the different things in there. So it's pretty complicated. We won't go into that depth in this class. So remodeling occurs in response to stresses on the bone. The more stress we have in place, the more the osteoblasts are going to try to build things up. The weak areas, showing little micro cracks or things like that, are going to be reinforced. Unused areas are going to be dismantled. No reason for me to be here. I'm going to move things around. So getting up, getting moving helps keep our bones strong. The ability to do this remodeling changes as we mature. As we get older, as you get to my age, I'm probably not being as good about remodeling as you are. Some of you are still actively growing. Remodeling can atrophy, shrink the bone. So we think about that osteoporosis, osteomalacia. As we get older, we may not move as much, maybe we're not. Those bones are going to wither away. We have hypertrophy. Those bones can increase in size, especially at the growth plates, but you can also have weird bumps and stuff that may occur in places. That remodeling can repair breaks. So that same process has to occur. That's one of the reasons we have to set the bone, put everything back together to allow that soft tissue to reestablish and then be ossified. And that takes a few weeks for that to happen. We can rearrange the bone internal structure to resist stress depending on how we're moving, whether we're running or weightlifting or milking cows versus feeding cows. All those are going to put different stresses on the bone. Those stresses will be responded to by the osteoblast and the osteoclast. So depending on where we are, the spongy bone is going to rearrange. So we got good scaffolding in there, good trusses. And then as we need or don't need, those osteons are going to either proliferate or they're going to be removed. So what about calcium's other functions? Not just in the bones. Calcium has a couple other functions. It helps with blood pH. It helps muscle contractions. Bone acts as a reserve. So one of the things we got to think about is calcium homeostasis. How do we keep blood calcium levels constant? How do we make sure there's enough calcium in the blood, enough calcium in the muscle, enough calcium in the cells to make sure all the things in our body need to happen? So the challenges with calcium from a nutritional standpoint is it's scarce. So when we get a hold of it, we certainly want to store some for later in case we need it. The kidney is real good at making sure the calcium in the blood stays in the blood. It doesn't get lost in the urine. We also will excrete calcium in the large intestines if we have too much of it. Calcium is also a challenge because in the blood, it's not very soluble. It doesn't dissolve well or easily in water. So one of the kind of, at least in my mind, kind of the jokes of the world is that people that don't want to drink milk but want to get their calcium and vitamin D will get fortified orange juice. Has anybody seen that? So you go and you look at the orange juice, fortified with calcium and fortified with vitamin D. So in theory, one of the reasons you drink milk is for the calcium. The downside of that is orange juice tends to be slightly acidic. The acidity makes the calcium precipitate out. So if you let that carton or that bottle sit for a little bit, Then you pour it out gently, you're going to see all the calcium at the bottom. So you're paying for calcium that you may not be consuming. So standard lab testing means I have to shake the container, get that calcium. It's not dissolved, but it's in suspension, and then I measure it that way. So the bone acts as a reserve for a variety of minerals. We're going to talk about calcium in this class. So bone tissue acts as a reservoir. When calcium is needed by the rest of the body, the bone can supply it. If we think about our lactating cows, for the first 100 and 150 days, she is taking calcium out of her bones, putting it in the milk to feed that calf. The second half of lactation, she's building up those reserves for her next time around. So when calcium is needed, bone can supply. When calcium is in excess, the bone can store it. So when it's around, it's a good thing to have. We'll store some for later if we can. At least the squirrels in my yard, and there were a lot of them till the eagle found the place. We had a bald eagle sits in the tree, and our population of squirrels has gone way down. They found a jaw, I assume it was a deer jaw. They were running around the yard with it, hopefully going to consume that bone, keep their teeth right, and to store calcium for when they needed it later. The regulation of calcium is controlled by hormones. And these two hormones act on one cell type. So to control blood calcium, we've got two hormones and one blood cell type. The one hormone is parathyroid hormone, sometimes called PTH. We have calcitonin. Both are produced by the thyroid. Parathyroid. So the parathyroid's job is to sense what the level of calcium in the blood is, and if it's out of range, it's going to secrete either PTH or calcitonin. And then the cell type that we're dealing with is called the osteocyte. So we said already that the osteocyte is the ATM or the teller in the bank. Depending on which signal it gets, PTH or calcitonin, it will either take calcium out of the blood, put it in the bank, or withdraw calcium and put it in the blood. So when calcium is needed, PTH pulls calcium from the bone. So PTH, secreted by the parathyroid, goes to the osteocyte in the bones, tells the osteocyte, pull calcium from the bone, put it in the blood, therefore blood calcium is increased. So sensor in the parathyroid sends out a signal to increase blood calcium. When calcium is in excess, calcitonin will put it away, save it for later. So calcitonin, secreted by the parathyroid, flows through the blood, gets to an osteocyte in the bone. The osteocyte's going to take that calcium out of the blood and secrete it to bone, thereby reducing blood calcium. So osteocytes do all the work here. So the activity of the osteocyte is what we need to control, and as you might guess moving forward, The osteocyte is going to be pretty important when it comes to milk fever. So we'll stop there. Next time we'll talk about how calcium flows through the body, where milk fever comes from and why it happens, and maybe get into muscles.
Monday.